Hey everyone, it's Bina 007 here for the Vassals of Kingsgrave Agatha Christie linear reread. This is episode 52 and we'll be discussing The Pale Horse, originally published in November 1961. We've had a little bit of a hiatus as Vassals of Kingsgrave goes back to its core competence, which is discussing fantasy books and their adaptations. So we've been publishing a lot of episodes about the House of the Dragon. But now that that's finished, it's time to get back on the Agatha Christie bandwagon and continue with our reread. As always, the episode will be spoiler free to the end credits music, and then we'll discuss the solution and the clues thereafter. So, this is an interesting novel. It takes us into the 1960s. The last novel was Cat Among the Pigeons, published 2 years prior. And the next novel will be The Mirror Cracked, which will be published a year later. So we're definitely now in that late phase of Agatha Christie's career. You know, she's in her early 70s now, so the pace has slowed down somewhat. And it's a bit of an interesting novel because it adopts a more gothic, supernatural tone. And because it has Ariadne Oliver as a minor character, but really it's almost a sort of standalone novel. And I would say of Ariadne Oliver, if you read this novel carefully, you will get a clue to the solution of The Mirror Cracked, which to me suggests that Agatha Christie was already noodling around with the idea for that novel. And both novels share in common the concept of a starlet, a Hollywood star, opening an English country fete. Now, where does this very strange title come from? It is mentioned, the pale horse, in the book of Revelation, so it's a biblical reference. And this is the passage. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat upon him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with a sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. So it is a very portentous title. And it has been suggested that this novel reflects the tone of the supernatural novels of Dennis Wheatley, who I had never heard of, but I did do a bit of research for reading this novel. And apparently at this point he was at the height of his popularity, so maybe consciously or subconsciously, Agatha Christie was influenced by him. And the setup, the conceit of the novel is as follows. There's a woman called Mrs. Davis who is dying, and she gives her last confession to the Catholic priest Father Gorman. And along with the confession, she gives him a list of names and a terrible secret. And he puts that list of names tucked up in his shoe. But before he can take action, he is struck dead in the fog of London. So the police begin to investigate his death, but also we have a separate protagonist who is going to be investigating the murder here. And the list, the very portentous list, has the following names on it: Ormerod, Sandford, Parkinson, Hesketh Dubois, Shaw, and Harmonsworth, Tuckerton, Corrigan, and Delafontaine, And luckily, some of these are rather unusual names, and so it will be possible to link them for the protagonist and to figure out a little of what's going on. In terms of Christie-verse connections, we've got Ariadne Oliver, who by now has appeared in many novels, often with Hercule Poirot. We also have Colonel Despard as a minor character. So if you remember Cards on the Table, he is the one that ends up marrying Rhoda Dawes, so they will also appear here many years later. And then we also have the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who also appeared in the Moving Finger, Miss Marple novel. So it's kind of nice to see that explicit linking of picking up characters that we've seen long ago. This is also, I think, one of the best novels for describing and understanding the social change going on in England at the time. As I said, we've entered the 1960s and you're definitely in a younger world. Like a lot of the people mentioned on that list are younger, and you're going to see the rise of the beatnik and a bit of social revolution going on in London and sexual revolution indeed. And it's fun to see Agatha Christie commenting on that in her usual sex positive but slightly disapproving of messiness way that she has. The first thing to note is that the book opens with an espresso machine and a coffee bar. And this was a big deal in this period. So post-war London in particular, we had a lot of Italian immigrants coming in, bringing in coffee bars, espresso machines, the exoticism of a cappuccino, particularly in Soho, but other areas of London too. And this is how the novel opens. Chapter 1, Mark Easterbrook's narrative. And Mark Easterbrook is going to be our protagonist. The espresso machine behind my shoulder hissed like an angry snake. The noise it had made had a sinister, not to say devilish, suggestion about it. Perhaps, I reflected, most of our contemporary noises carry that implication. The intimidating, angry scream of jet planes as they flash across the sky, the slow, menacing rumble of a tube train approaching through its tunnel, the heavy road transport that shakes the very foundation of your house. Even the minor domestic noises of today, beneficial in action though they may be, yet carry a kind of alert. The dishwashers, the refrigerators, the pressure cookers, the whining vacuum cleaners. Be careful, they all seem to say. I am a genie harnessed to your service, but if your control of me fails. A dangerous world that was. A dangerous world. End quote. I think this is a wonderful passage in so many ways because it's an acute observation of modern life. And if you think back to the mysterious affair of Styles, written back in the 1920s, when people were travelling by horse and cart, and then on to the novels of the 1920s, where sometimes a very rich protagonist might roll around in a very expensive motor car, but it was very unusual. It wasn't something common to have heavy traffic. And in those days, Agatha Christie was writing of big country houses run by teams of staff. And now we're in the modern urban world where what those staff would do is gone, right? Because we have household domestic conveniences like dishwashers and vacuum cleaners. So I think it's kind of interesting just to cast our minds back to the 1920s when Agatha first started writing and just to appreciate her appreciation of how the rhythms and the noises and the experiences of life has changed. Here's Ariadne Oliver also commenting on social change. Quote, I saw a girl pull out another girl's hair by the roots the other night, I said. I was conscious of a slight note of pride in my voice as the one who had seen life. What extraordinary places have you been going to? Asked Mrs. Oliver. This was in a coffee bar in Chelsea. Oh, Chelsea, said Mrs. Oliver. Everything happens there, I believe. Beatniks and sputniks and squares and the beat generation. I don't write about them much because I'm so afraid of getting the terms wrong. It's safer, I think, to stick to what you know, end quote. Which is wonderful metatext, isn't it? And I suppose Agatha Christie may have been a little frightened of getting the terms wrong and their self-mockery with beatniks and sputniks. But actually, I think she does capture something of the younger generation, and I applaud her trying. It's interesting, isn't it, with Cat Among the Pigeon, her book prior, also dealing with much younger children, children of her grandchildren's generation. So bravo, Agatha, and, how wonderful that self-aware, slight mocking tone she takes, as always, through Ariadne Oliver. Okay, so before we get into the characters of the novel and what happens, let's see a little of the context in which the readers would have received this Christie for Christmas in 1961. And, that reference to Sputniks, to technology, that's all sitting within the world that they're living in. So since the publication of Cats Among the Pigeon, we are seeing the events of December 1959. So we've got the Cold War, the Antarctic Treaty is signed, setting aside Antarctica as a scientific preserve. Now, I think rather under question, isn't it, in this new Cold War? January 1960, a major insurrection occurs in Algiers against French colonial policy. February 1960, we have the Greensboro sit-ins, so the civil rights movement. 4 black students from North Carolina begin a sit-in at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter where they've been refused service. If you ever go to the Museum of African American Heritage in Washington, D.C., they have a replica of that lunch counter. It's both fascinating and moving to see. In March 1960, Alberto Corda takes his iconic photograph of Che Guevara in Havana. In the Vietnam War, the United States announces that 3,500 soldiers will be sent to Vietnam. It sounds so little, isn't it, in the scope of what came later? The Canton of Geneva in Switzerland gave women the right to vote. So late, Switzerland. Crazy, crazy place. And then US President Eisenhower approves a covert CIA plan to train a paramilitary force against Cuba, which would then result in the 1961 disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. In April 60, we have the April Revolution. South Korean students hold a nationwide pro-democracy protest, which leads to the president of South Korea resigning from office. And we also have in the Cold War the U-2 incident, where several Soviet surface-to-air missiles shoot down an American Lockheed U-2 spy plane, and its pilot Francis Gary Powers of the CIA is captured. In May 1960, in Buenos Aires, four Mossad agents abduct fugitive Nazi German war criminal Adolf Eichmann so that he can be taken to Israel and put on prime. And he will later be convicted and executed in 1962. In June 1960, we have the premiere of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And in the Belgian Congo, it gets its independence from Belgium and becomes the Republic of Congo. A civil war begins shortly that will last for many, many years. In September 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, still alive and kicking, is founded by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. In October 1960, Nigeria becomes independent from the UK. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, pounds his shoe on a table at the United Nations. Very iconic moment. And in December 1960, troops loyal to Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia overcome the coup that began on December 13th, returning the reins to the emperor upon his return from a trip to Brazil. It's fascinating, isn't it? It feels very much like Cat Among the Pigeons opening plot. January 61, JFK now is sworn in as President of the United States. And British authorities announced they have uncovered a large Soviet spy ring, the Portland spy ring in London. And Patrice Lumumba, the President of the Republic of Congo, is assassinated. In March 1961, Barbie gets a boyfriend when the Ken doll is introduced in the United States. In April 1961, the trial of Eichmann begins in Jerusalem. In Portugal, a military coup attempt against Antonio de Oliveira Salazar fails, and we get the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. In May of 1961, the birth date of modern genetics is J. Heinrich Mattei performs the poly-U experiment, the first person to recognize and understand the genetic code. In May 1961, we also have Alabama Governor John Patterson declaring martial law in an attempt to restore order after race riots break out. And President Kennedy announces before a special joint session of Congress its goal to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. June 1961, the British protectorate ends in Kuwait and it becomes an emirate. In August 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall begins, which is a very sad day, but maybe, very symbolic of how the Cold War is accelerating in this period. In September 1961, the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld dies in an air crash en route to Katanga, Congo. Many conspiracy theories about this as a potential assassination, really interesting part of history. And we also in that month get a military coup in Damascus, Syria, effectively ending the United Arab Republic, which was the union between Egypt and Syria, also very reminiscent of Cat Among the Pigeons. We also get, very close to my heart, the first edition of Private Eye, the British satirical magazine, something I still subscribe to. And in November 1961, the month of publication of this book, Michael Rockefeller, son of New York governor and late Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, disappears in the jungles of New Guinea. Okay, so let's return to the book. And who are our characters? Well, as I said before, the protagonist is a chap called Mark Easterbrook. He's a historian researching the Moguls. He has a rather pretentious girlfriend called Hermia Redcliffe. Then there's a young lady called Catherine Corrigan, but her nickname is Ginger, and she joins Mark in his investigations. We then have David Ardingly, who's a historian friend of Mark's. We have Pamela Poppy Sterling, that's a nickname, Poppy, an employee of Flower Studios Limited, and she's David's girlfriend and flippantly says, you can bump people off. So this is what sort of tips them, I think, to the pale horse, this mythical thing that is resulting in murders. We also have Rhoda Despard, Mark, who turns out to be Mark Easterbrook's cousin from Cards on the Table. So it is interesting. Although I will note that at the time, Ariadne doesn't admit she knows them, which is a bit weird. And Colonel Hugh Despard, Rhoda's husband. Lady Hesketh Dubois, one of those names on the list I told you about at the start of the podcast. She is Mark's recently deceased godmother, who apparently died of a brain tumour. And then, of course, we have Ariadne Oliver, and she is another person that Mark happens to know. So that's going to, you can take the coincidence or not, but they're needed to power the investigation. And she happens to be going to open a fete in a village with a pale horse pub. And then we come to some of the victims of the murderer. So as I said, it starts with Mrs. Davis giving her confession. It turns out that she's one of the ladies. This was hugely popular in the post-war era of Britain, where sociology was this great new science. She conducted household services where these surveys, where these women would knock on doors and ask people about their household budgeting, what they bought, their status, their income. So she seems to have few possessions. She's a working class woman. Anyway, she apparently has died of pneumonia. And as we know, she gave her last confession to Father Gorman. He's coshed after giving her last rites with a list of names tucked into his shoe. And then we have a victim called Thomasina Tuckerton. And she turns out actually to be a rather wealthy young woman, even though she looks like a sort of unwashed beatnik. She's the one who Marquis Sprick sees getting into that fight in the coffee bar and having their hair torn out. And she apparently dies of encephalitis. And then we have Mary Delafontaine, who apparently dies from attack of something toxic. Ariadne Oliver knew her. So again, this is the linkage between Mark Easterbrook and Ariadne Oliver putting together the pieces and trying to figure out what's going on with the Pale Horse. We have some other people. So in London, we have Zachariah Osborne, a pharmacist. He was an eyewitness to the coshing of Father Gorman. And we do also learn that he wanted to be an actor. So those of you who know your Agatha Christie know to be on alert. And then in the little village of Much Deeping, where the Pale Horse pub is, we have the Reverend Dane Calthorpe, who's the local vicar, who we know from the Moving Finger, and his wife, Mrs. Dane Calthorpe. We also have Mr. Venables, who's a wealthy man who uses a wheelchair and has a really impressive antiquities collection. Then at the Pale Horse pub itself, which is a sort of former inn, we have three rather deliberately witchy-looking ladies. So we have Thurza Gray, who self-titled is a practitioner of the dark arts. We have Sybil Stamfordis, who is a medium, and Bella Webb, who is Thurza Gray's cook and self-professed witch. So they're very much leaning into the idea of, that Macbeth iconic thing of three witches living together. So those are the characters, and basically the plot of the story is Mark Easterbrook and Ariadne Oliver latterly trying to investigate: is this something supernatural? Are the witches casting spells to bump off people for money, or is there something far more mundane going on with murders for hire? In terms of progressive and regressive, we always talk about, don't we, on this podcast, whether novels hold up to a modern reader. And actually, I had nothing to write for this. So I think it is rather not progressive, but it's interesting because it comments on modern urban life and the beatniks. But there's nothing overtly racist or anti-Semitic or misogynistic, so thank goodness for that. And then we have The Reception. Was this a popular book? This is what Robert Barnard, he's a very famous critic, wrote of the book, and I think I rather agree. Goodish late example, loosely plotted but with intriguing, fantastical central idea. Plot concerns a Murder Inc. type organization with a strong overlay of black magic. Also makes use of quote-unquote the box, a piece of pseudoscientific hocus-pocus fashionable in the West Country in the 50s. One of the things which drove Evelyn Waugh to the verge of lunacy, as narrated in Pinfold. There are two adaptations of this book. The first was a ITV adaptation from 1996. It's a 100-minute TV film starring Colin Buchanan as Mark Easterbrook. It doesn't have Ariadne Oliver in it, which I think is a bit of a shame, and makes Easterbrook a suspect in the killing of Father Gorman, which is sort of how he gets involved. I did watch this. I didn't think it was particularly exciting or enigmatic, and I don't think it really holds up to a modern viewer. The second adaptation is interesting and I think does hold up a little bit. It was done in 2012 as part of, again, the ITV Agatha Christie's Marple series. It's the fifth season of it, and it's the season starring Julia Mackenzie. So it does become a Miss Marple. She becomes, the leading person in it. But oh my goodness, as with this Miss Marple series, it sort of holds up kind of if you just watch it on its own terms, but it bears very, very little resemblance to the book. There are a whole host of new characters. It turns out that Father Gorman's a friend of Miss Marple, and that's how she gets involved. It turns out the Pale Horse is now a hotel. Oh, I mean, it's just, there's so much that's different. It almost becomes a different work of art. So there we go. So those are the two ITV adaptations. And then we now come to the June 2019 adaptation, which is for the BBC. So it's the third adaptation, written by Sarah Phelps, who did the very famous and beloved And Then There Were None adaptation. I have issues with her adaptations too, because I think she imposes her own politics and contemporary concerns, and she also kind of pulls apart the structure of the book sometimes. This was a two-parter broadcast on BBC One in 2020. It had an amazing cast. It had Rufus Sewell as Mark Easterbrook, Sean Pertwee as Inspector Lejeune. It had Bertie Carvel as Zachariah Osborne. For those of you who know the wonderful Dr. Strange and Mr. Norrell, he starred in that. It had Kaya Scodelario as Hermia, Rita Chushingham, iconic, as one of the witches in Much Deeping. Again, it really does deviate from the plot of the book, but I think it is satisfying. I think it's doing something really interesting. So if you want to pick one adaptation to watch, I would probably pick that one. So I'm going to leave it there. After the end credits music, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is a mini pod, not a full pod, and give you some of 2.0, aka Pat's thoughts on this, which are full of spoilers. I'm going to take you through the plotting, the clues, the solutions, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, we'll meet again in the next episode to discuss The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, which is one of my favourite Christies. So here we go. Welcome back and be prepared for spoilers. So here are some of the clues that will take you through to the solution. Mr. Osborne says that Mr. Venables coshed the priest, which makes us wonder if Venables is faking. He isn't, but he is dodgy. Mr. Bradley in Birmingham takes bets so that people will die. Mark Easterbrook has a deceased first wife who cheated on him. No record of her death because she died in Italy. So Ginger pretends to be his ex-wife who needs him dead and hires Murder Inc. The three sisters then have a séance and slit the throat of a cockerel to give it that sort of air of supernatural cover. But we know that Agatha Christie doesn't believe in supernatural stuff. We know this from the Sitterford mystery and from Dumb Witness. So the first big clue that something's going on that isn't about dead cockerels having their throats slit and actual murder being committed is that Thomasina Tucker's hair fell out in that fight. But was the fight sufficiently brutal that her hair should have been falling out in clumps? Or maybe she's actually being poisoned. We also know that the customer research ladies are a little bit like the ABC murders salesman, that they go from door to door. So actually, why is she visiting those particular people, and what information is she trying to gather? And it turns out that what she has been gathering information for is what product can the poison thallium be put in. So for instance, if she visits the house of Thomasina Tucker, the girl whose hair's falling out, she might notice, oh, she uses a brand of toothpaste and it's half used. So we can now substitute that toothpaste with this one. And over time, she'll be poisoned and then she'll die. So the real solution is that the Murder Inc. Incorporation is poisoning people with thallium for money. The money is laid on as a bet, so that's how the money is being taken in. And actually, the novel apparently saved some people's lives because two readers recognized the symptoms of thallium poisoning from its description in the book and then could get help. The novel's also apparently the inspiration of what was dubbed the Mensa murder in 1988, when George Treppel, a Mensa Club member, poisoned his neighbours Pi and Peggy Carr and their children with thallium introduced into a Coca-Cola Classic bottle 8-pack. And Peggy sadly died, although the others survived. So who is really behind all of these murders? It's not the chap in Birmingham who's collecting the bets. It's actually the pharmacist, Mr. Osborne. With his spurious eyewitness account of seeing the priest being coshed, be suspicious. I mean, the guy was meant to have died in the fog, and yet this pharmacist from across the road says he can see it very clearly. And also, we as Agatha Christie lovers know that if anyone wants to be an actor or is an actor, they're probably dodgy in putting on an act. So this is why this is a mini pod. I wanted to read out what Pat had as his impression. The Pale Horse, bottom tier Christie for me. I can see why many Christie fans, like the podcast All About Agatha, would like it. New twist in the serial killer criminal. Links to both Poirot through Ariadne Oliver and Miss Marple through Mrs. Dane Calthrop. But the fan service isn't enough for me. It lacks the humour and charm of much of her earlier work. In particular, the sly social observational eye that Christie used with such vicious, malevolent fun In earlier works, when directed at the upper classes, bigots and misogynists, seems to come across as disappointingly reactionary when directed at the younger generation entering the swinging 60s, which was the only time I felt she tried it. While there is a bit of meta insight into Christie as a person through Ariadne Oliver, the glimpses are short and too disjointed to elevate the book. I also didn't find the book well clued, and though the plot was well thought out, I didn't feel the reveal was handled as well as Christie has done in other books. Finally, I felt there was a missed opportunity. In Appointment with Death, Christie demonstrated that she can write the macabre, even though our detectives inevitably debunk it. This was a great opportunity, which she wasted in my opinion. The three witches only ever seemed to come over as charlatans to me. Christie never convinced us that they had genuinely got into the protagonist's mind to show a fear of the supernatural. Overall, as is mostly the case, I would give Christie full marks for the idea, but she has executed her ideas much better in other books, making them funnier, scarier, more gripping, and more engaging. In her best books, she pulls it off to make a satisfying read. This one just didn't grab me. I completely agree. So, with that note, we will leave our mini pod there and join us next time for thoughts on The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. Thank you for listening. And if you want to get more discussion with Pat, me, and others, feel free to join the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord server. You can find a link to that on our YouTube channels page. Just search for VOK Podcast or Vassals of Kingsgrave, or on our WordPress page.